Why are so many cemeteries hidden in the woods? Have you ever been walking through the woods, maybe hiking, hunting, or exploring an old dirt road, and suddenly you stumble across something unexpected? A few old gravestones. Sometimes they're broken, sometimes they're leaning over, sometimes they're almost completely swallowed by trees and vines. And the strange part is, there's nothing else around them. No houses, no church, no town, just graves in the middle of the forest. If you spend any time exploring rural areas in the United States, especially in places like Texas, Tennessee, Georgia, or the Carolinas, you'll eventually run into one of these forgotten cemeteries. Which raises an interesting question. Why are so many cemeteries hidden in the woods? Were they always built there? Did people intentionally bury their dead deep in the forest? Or did something happen to the towns that once surrounded them? Today we're going to answer that question because the truth behind these forest cemeteries tells an incredible story about early American life, frontier settlements, disease, and how entire communities can disappear over time. The first thing to understand is this. Most of these cemeteries were not originally built in the forest. When many of these graves were placed in the 1800s or even earlier, the land around them was often cleared farmland, small communities, or church property. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially in rural America, people commonly buried their dead in family cemeteries. Instead of a large public graveyard like we see today, families would set aside a small section of their property as a burial ground. This might be on a hill overlooking the farm, near a church, or on land that wasn't suitable for crops. Over time, several generations of the same family might be buried there. You might see markers from grandparents, parents, children, extended relatives, all within a few yards of each other. These family cemeteries were extremely common across the United States before the early 1900s, and many of them still exist today. But something important happened over the next 100 years. The farms disappeared. The houses disappeared. The roads changed. And the forest grew back, leaving the graves behind. One of the biggest reasons cemeteries appear hidden in the woods today is something called land reforestation. In the 1800s and early 1900s, large parts of the United States, especially in the South and Midwest, were cleared for agriculture. Farmers cut down forests to grow cotton, corn, wheat, and other crops. By the early 20th century, many of those farms were abandoned. There were several reasons for this. Some soil became exhausted from decades of farming. Some families moved to cities during industrialization. Others left rural areas during events like the Great Depression or the Dust Bowl. When farmland is abandoned, nature moves back in surprisingly quick. Trees began growing again. Bush and vines spread. Within a few decades, land that once held farms and homes can look like untouched forest. This process happened across millions of acres in the United States. So when you find a cemetery in the woods today, it often isn't because the cemetery was just built in the forest. It's because the forest grew back around it. Another major reason these cemeteries seem isolated today is the disappearance of entire towns. During the 1800s, many small communities formed around these industries like logging, railroads, mining, farming, and even mills. These were often small settlements with only a few dozen or a few hundred residents. When the industry that supported the town disappeared, the town often disappeared with it. Logging towns are a great example. In many parts of the South, including East Texas, large timber operations created temporary communities deep in the forest. Workers and their families lived there while the timber was being harvested. Once the trees were cut and the lumber companies moved on, the town shut down. Buildings were abandoned or dismantled, but the cemetery remained. The same thing happened with the railroad camps, mining settlements, and rural farming communities. Over time, the structures decay and vanished, but the stone grave markers could last centuries. Which is why The cemetery is often the only visible reminder that a community once existed there. Many forest cemeteries were also connected to churches. In the 1800s, small rural churches were extremely common. These churches often maintained their own burial grounds. Members of the congregation were buried beside the church building, but rural churches frequently relocated or closed. Sometimes the congregation moved to a nearby town, sometimes the building deteriorated or collapsed, and sometimes the land was sold. When that happened, the cemetery often remained even after the church structure was gone. Over decades, trees and vegetation reclaimed the land, leaving a cluster of graves where a church once stood. If you explore rural cemeteries, you'll often notice graves arranged in neat rows or family plots. This layout is a clue that the site was once part of a churchyard. You may also notice that many of these cemeteries sit on small hills or elevated ground. That wasn't random. Early settlers often placed cemeteries on hills for practical reasons. First, higher ground helps prevent flooding. Graves placed in low areas could become waterlogged or disturbed during a heavy rain. Second, hilltops were often land that wasn't ideal for farming. Farmers preferred flat, fertile land for crops, so rocky or elevated areas were sometimes set aside for burial grounds. There was also a cultural element. In many Christian traditions, elevated burial sites carried symbolic meaning, representing a place closer to heaven or overlooking the community. So hilltop cemeteries became a common feature across rural America. Today, many of these small historic cemeteries are protected by law. In several states, including Texas, descendants and members of the public often have legal right to access historical burial sites, even if they're located on private property. These laws exist because cemeteries are considered culturally and historically important. They preserve records of communities that may no longer exist. In many cases, genealogists and historians use these graves to reconstruct family histories and settlement patterns. Without these cemeteries, huge portions of local history would be lost. That's why volunteers, historians, and local groups sometimes work to document and preserve forgotten graveyards. So the next time that you find a cemetery deep in the woods, it probably wasn't just built there. Instead, you're looking at the last surviving piece of a community that once existed. A farm where a family lived for generations, a church where people gathered every Sunday, a small town that grew up around a railroad, mill, or a logging operation. The houses disappeared, the roads changed, the forest returned. But the graves remained. Silent reminders that people once lived, worked, and built their lives in places that today seem completely forgotten. And in many cases, those small cemeteries are the only evidence that communities ever existed at all. If you enjoy exploring history like this, make sure to subscribe because there are countless forgotten stories hidden in the landscapes around us. Sometimes all you have to do is follow the gravestones.